Everyone, we last left off in our discussion with the fact that the carbon dating in 1988 showed that it was a forgery. Well, I want to go back a little further, back to the STIRP team of 78. In 1978, an international group of scientists from all over the world assembled to get permission to do a bunch of tests on the Shroud. So this was scientific tests to be able to determine how was the image made. It was not there to determine if the linen was the actual burial cloth of Christ, but just to see how was it formed, and that's something science can answer. So we're going to walk through some of the findings and some of the things that are interesting about this. First of all, what they did was they opened, they opened the shroud was attached to a backing cloth, and what they did was they opened that up, and they took a light and they put this light underneath the shroud and shined it up through the linen. And this is a test you and I could do. Um, they shined the light through the image, and there was no density to the image, right? So if this was a forgery, then there might have been paint, right, or oils that would have been used to make the image. But there was no density, and therefore it was not painted or it was not done with any kind of oil. So immediately you can eliminate the primary way that forgeries were done back then. The next thing is that history would have not known about the wrist wounds. In the Middle Ages, if you go to the art that is that it was done of the crucifixion of Jesus, all of the wounds were through the palm. They really believed that. And yet on the shroud, that's not the case. It was through the mesocarpal region of the wrist. And the and so why would if I were a forger and I wanted to sell it, because that's the goal of forgers is to sell their forgeries. And I would want to make it something that everybody would expect. And yet this would have not been what people expected. Also, beside that, the wounds on the back, as you can kind of see up there, this is a close up of the wounds. These are flagrum wounds, and to I'm going to just point over there is an example of a flagrum where there was long strips of leather with bones and metal pieces and hooks attached onto these leather straps, and then you would whip it into someone's back, and it would tear into their back and rip. And as you can see above, you see the small little spaces between the different pieces of injury, and that's very unique. And so what you find is that they've counted it up 148 points of entry. Um, and also about when the I think we might have talked about this before. When you pierce the median nerve, um, it forces the nerve to cause the thumb to go in. And on the shroud, you see no thumbs, that they're stuck underneath. And that is very historically accurate, something that a forger could not have known, would not have had um, that kind of historical and scientific knowledge. Another thing is Dr. Alan Wenger of Duke University did some studies on the images of the eyes, and he saw that under digital photography, that there was placed on the eyes Roman coins minted from like 29 AD. He found and saw very clearly the hook of this of these coins on the eyes, which was really fascinating. Again, coins that would have been inaccessible to people who were forging in the Middle Ages. Also, interestingly, the blood. This is really kind of cool. Blood is fresh. When the STIRP team went there and they saw the blood on the image, they're like, this can't be human blood, of course, because it's too red, it's too fresh. There's no way. And so um, they took little sticky back tape and they put it on the blood and to take and study later, and they actually found that it was authentic human blood, and even they were determined that it was an AB positive blood type. And so that was very, very unique. Again, so and even beyond that, if you're a forger, you can say, well, okay, I'm going to do this forgery of Jesus. I'm going to just take my blood and drop it on there and pretend like it's blood. Couple things here. There were high levels of bilirubin in this blood, which meant that it was found in which is found in trauma victims. Okay, so here's how this works. If I were to cut open my blood now and drip it onto the table, it would um, it would not have any bilirubin in it. But if you come at me and we were about to fight, and I knew my fight or flight um, uh, hormones were up, it would flood the bloodstream with bilirubin to protect it. And so then, if I were bleeding after you beat me up, there and you took that blood, you would find lots of bilirubin. So what it says about the blood on this shroud is that it was taken from someone who had just gone through, within a couple hours, significant trauma. Again, how would a forger known about that? A forger would have had to know, because again, you don't. These are microscopic, scientific data, and so in order you would have the forger would have to assume that microscopes were were going to exist in some future time, right? And that would know and guess that there might be something in the blood that would be significant under trauma. So there's no way of that, right? So that was significant. Also, if I were making a forgery, what I would do is I put the image down onto the shroud and then put the blood in the right places. But what they discovered by the STERP team about the Shroud of Turin is that the blood was placed on the shroud before the image. The image is on top of the blood, which means the blood was there, then the image was formed. That doesn't make sense for a forgery, but it does make sense according to the story of Jesus, where the body would have been wrapped in the shroud, and his body would have bled onto the shroud, and then the image would have happened on the shroud after that. People, just to kind of jump ahead, people have suggested that this shroud's image happened at the moment of resurrection. We'll talk about that in a minute. But continuing on here, they also took UV light, and they because the image kind of dark like a scorch, so they thought, well, maybe it was burned on there, which was another technique used by forgers. So what they did is they took UV light and they shined it up through the scorches, and they, on the where the shroud had been burned, and they saw those scorches. But when they put the UV light underneath the image, it did not show up, proving once and for all. And again, this is a scientific study that you and I could do. Discovered that in fact, the shroud's image is not a scorch. They also discovered that that the shallow markings of the shroud only go to 1/500th of an inch thick. That's 1/10 the thickness of a human hair. And we cannot replicate this today. Super fascinating. We'll come back next time, with the next set of slides.